Margaret Hayes sat on the floor of her bedroom, surrounded by boxes and folders that smelled like old paper and her husband's cologne. 3 weeks had passed since Robert's funeral, and she still couldn't believe he was gone. Just like that, one moment he was laughing at breakfast, complaining about the weather. The next, he was clutching his chest in the garage, and by the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. 32 years of marriage, and now she was alone. The house felt too big, too quiet. Every corner held a memory. The kitchen where they'd danced on Sunday mornings. The living room where they'd watched their kids grow up. Even the garage where she still couldn't bring herself to park the car. Her daughter Lisa had been pushing her to go through Robert's things. "Mom, you don't have to do it all at once," she'd said. "Just a little at a time." But Margaret needed to stay busy. If she stopped moving, stopped sorting, stopped organizing, the grief would swallow her whole. She opened another filing cabinet drawer, expecting more of the same. Tax returns, insurance policies, old utility bills. Robert had been meticulous about paperwork, sometimes annoyingly so. But as she pulled out a folder marked personal, something slipped out and landed on the carpet. It was a property deed. Margaret picked it up, squinting at the small print. The address meant nothing to her. 2847 Maple Street. She'd lived in this town for over 3 decades and had never heard of that street. The deed was in Robert's name only, purchased 15 years ago for $75,000. Her hands started shaking. $75,000. Where had that money come from? They'd always shared everything, discussed every major purchase. When they bought their son's first car, they'd debated for weeks. When they'd renovated the bathroom, they'd gone over the budget together line by line. But this? A whole house, and she knew nothing about it? Margaret's mind began racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was it an investment property Robert had forgotten to mention? But how do you forget to mention a house for 15 years? Was it a rental? But there were no rental agreements in the folder, no records of income. Her stomach twisted. Could Robert have been living some kind of double life? The thought seemed ridiculous. This was Robert, her Robert, who called her every day at lunch just to say hi, who never missed their anniversary, who cried at their daughter's wedding, but people had secrets. She'd seen enough daytime television to know that. Perfectly normal husbands who turned out to have entire second families. Men who seemed devoted but were living lies. No, not Robert. Not her Robert. Still, her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She grabbed her phone and called Lisa. Her daughter answered on the 3rd ring, sounding distracted. "Hey, Mom, what's up?" "I'm just in the middle of... Did your father ever mention a property on Maple Street?" Silence. "What? No, I don't think so. Why?" Margaret explained what she'd found. She could hear Lisa moving to a quieter place, probably stepping away from her kids. "That's really weird, Mom." "Are you sure it's recent? Maybe it's something really old that he forgot about. It says he bought it 15 years ago. That's not that long ago. We were still..." Her voice cracked. "We were still us. Mom, don't jump to conclusions. There could be a perfectly reasonable explanation." "Like what?" Lisa hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe it was an investment thing. Or maybe he was helping someone. You know how Dad was always trying to help people." That was true. Robert had been the kind of man who stopped to help strangers change tires, who donated to every charity that called, who volunteered at the food bank every Thanksgiving. But buying a secret house seemed like a stretch even for him. "I'm going to call your brother," Margaret said. "Mom, wait. Maybe you should just..." But Margaret had already hung up. She dialed her son Paul's number. He was the logical one, the practical one. If anyone could make sense of this, it would be Paul. He didn't know anything either. A house on Maple Street? Never heard Dad mention it. Did you check if there are any mortgage documents? Maybe there's more paperwork that explains it. Margaret went back to the filing cabinet, pulling out folders with shaking hands. She found more documents related to the property. Tax payments, all current. Utility bills in Robert's name. But no mortgage, which meant he'd paid cash. And no explanation for why. Her sister Betty called an hour later. Lisa must have told her. "Margaret, honey, I really think you shouldn't go there alone." "I have to see it, Betty. I have to know." "Then let me come with you. Or wait for Lisa. Just don't go by yourself." "What if..." Betty paused. "What if there's something there you're not ready to see?" Margaret knew what her sister was implying. Another woman. Another family. The things wives discovered after their husbands died. The secrets that came crawling out of closets. "I need to do this," Margaret said quietly. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the last 15 years. Had there been signs? Times when Robert was distant or secretive? Unexplained absences? He'd always worked construction, sometimes long hours. He'd come home tired, covered in dust, smelling like sawdust and sweat. But he'd always been there for dinner, always tucked the kids in when they were little, always fell asleep next to her watching television. Saturday mornings, he'd always left early. Running errands, he'd say. Getting supplies, she'd never questioned it. Why would she? He always came back by lunch, sometimes bringing flowers or her favorite pastries. Saturday mornings for 15 years. Oh, God. The next morning, Margaret got dressed in a daze. She found the keys in Robert's safe deposit box at the bank, along with some cash and their important documents. There were 3 keys on a ring labeled only with the address. Her hands trembled as she held them. The drive across town felt like it took forever and no time at all. She programmed the address into her phone's GPS and followed the robotic voice's directions. Left on Oak, right on Pine, straight through the light. Maple Street turned out to be in a quiet neighborhood she'd driven through before but never really noticed. Small houses, well-kept lawns, old trees lining the sidewalk. It looked peaceful. Normal. The kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. Number 2847 was a cottage-style house, painted light blue with white trim. The lawn was mowed, the bushes trimmed. Someone was taking care of it. The mailbox had no name, just the numbers. Margaret sat in her car for 10 minutes, staring at the house. A neighbor walked by with a dog, glancing at her curiously. A car drove past. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Finally, she got out of the car. Her legs felt weak as she walked up the front path. The keys felt heavy in her hand, like they weighed 1,000 pounds. She stood at the door, key hovering near the lock. This was it. Whatever was inside would either confirm her worst fears or explain everything. Either way, her life was about to change. The key slid in smoothly. The lock clicked. Margaret Hayes pushed open the door and stepped inside her late husband's secret life. The first thing Margaret noticed was how normal it looked. Not abandoned, not dusty, not forgotten. The house was clean, lived in, loved. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains onto hardwood floors. A couch sat against one wall, worn but comfortable looking. A bookshelf filled with novels and children's books. A coffee table with a neat stack of magazines, children's books. Margaret's heart started pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She took a few steps inside, leaving the door open behind her like an escape route. The living room opened into a small dining area, and beyond that she could see a kitchen. Everything was tidy, ordinary. A house where people lived their lives, but who? She moved slowly, as if walking through a dream. Or a nightmare. She wasn't sure which yet. On the mantel above a small fireplace there were photographs. Lots of them. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she picked up the first frame. Robert. Her Robert. But not with her. Not with their kids. He was standing with 2 children, a boy and a girl, his arms around their shoulders. They were at some kind of park, all 3 of them grinning at the camera. Robert looked happy. Really, genuinely happy. She picked up another photo. The same kids, younger this time. The boy holding a baseball bat. Robert crouching next to him, showing him how to grip it. Another photo. The girl at a piano. Robert sitting beside her on the bench. More photos. Birthday parties with candles and cakes, Christmas mornings with a small tree. School photos in those classic backgrounds. Years and years of photos. A whole life she knew nothing about. Margaret's knees went weak. She sat down hard on the couch, the picture frame still in her hand. The children in the photos looked Latino, with dark hair and warm brown skin. The boy had a gap-toothed smile that reminded her of her own son at that age. The girl had long dark hair and serious eyes. Who were they? Robert's children? Had he had an affair? But the timeline didn't make sense. 15 years ago, their own kids had still been in middle school. They'd been happy. Or she'd thought they were happy. She set down the frame with shaking hands and stood up. She needed to see more, needed to understand. The house wasn't large, maybe 1,200 square feet. 2 bedrooms, probably. She walked down a short hallway. The first bedroom was clearly the boys' room. Twin bed with a blue comforter, posters of basketball players on the walls, a desk covered with school papers and textbooks. Margaret picked up one of the papers. A math test dated 3 months ago. Grade, a minus. At the top, in a teacher's handwriting, "Excellent work, Danny." Danny. The boy had a name. The closet was full of clothes, teenage boy clothes, organized and neat. Nothing expensive, but everything clean and well cared for. On the nightstand was a framed photo of Robert making a funny face, the boy laughing beside him. Margaret backed out of the room, her vision blurring with tears. She wiped her eyes and opened the second bedroom door. The girl's room was painted a soft yellow, a double bed with a purple blanket, bookshelves crammed with books, a keyboard in the corner. The walls were covered with drawings and paintings, all signed in the bottom corner. Sophie in careful cursive. Butterflies and flowers, portraits of people, abstract swirls of color. Sophie. The girl had a name, too. On the desk, Margaret found more school papers, a report card with straight A's, a program from a school music recital with Sophie's name highlighted. Next to the keyboard was a folder of sheet music covered with Robert's handwriting. Notes in the margins. Practice this part. Remember to breathe. You've got this, kiddo. Margaret sank onto the girl's bed and let herself cry. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. How could Robert have done this? How could he have had this whole secret life, these secret children, and never said a word? 32 years of marriage, and she hadn't known him at all. After a while, the tears stopped. She sat there, hollow and exhausted, staring at the walls, at Sophie's artwork, at the photos of a little girl growing up, and Robert there for all of it. She needed to see the rest of the house, needed all the pieces before she fell apart completely. She walked back to the kitchen, forcing herself to look at everything. The refrigerator was covered with drawings held up by magnets. More A's on tests. A calendar hung on the wall, and Margaret's hands shook as she looked at it. Every Saturday for every week going back months, there was an entry in Robert's handwriting. Visit day. Sometimes there were other notes too. Danny's game 10 a.m. Sophie's recital 2 p.m. Science fair project every single Saturday. All those years of running errands. All those mornings he'd left her alone to come here, to these children, to this life he'd built without her. Margaret opened the refrigerator without thinking. It was mostly empty, but there were some basics. Milk that hadn't expired yet. Eggs. Some fruit. Like someone was coming back soon. Like Robert had been here recently. Of course he had. He'd been here every week until he died. She opened drawers, cupboards, still moving on autopilot. Everything was modest but sufficient. No fancy gadgets or expensive dishes, but nothing missing either. A home where people had everything they needed. In one drawer, she found envelopes. Bills mostly all addressed to Robert at this address. Electric, gas, water, all paid on time. In another drawer, a checkbook with Robert's name. She flipped through the register. Regular payments for groceries, clothes, school supplies. Bigger payments occasionally labeled field trip or school supplies or new shoes. At the back of the drawer, she found a folder stuffed with papers. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out and sat down at the kitchen table. Medical records for Danny Rodriguez and Sophie Rodriguez. Vaccination records, dental checkups, everything dated and organized. Robert listed as the emergency contact Rodriguez, not Hayes, so not his children, at least not legally. But then who were they? There were school enrollment forms, both children listed at the local middle school. Emergency contacts, Robert Hayes and Elena Rodriguez. Elena, a woman's name. The mother. Margaret's stomach twisted. She kept digging through the papers. More school forms, report cards going back years, permission slips for field trips all signed by Robert, scholarship applications for a summer art program, a music camp, all sponsored by Robert. At the very bottom of the folder, she found letters. Her hands shook as she pulled out the first one, dated 5 years ago. The handwriting was feminine, graceful. Dear Robert, I don't have the words to thank you for everything you've done for us. Danny aced his English test and he says it's because you helped him study. Sophie talks about you all the time. You've given my children something I could never give them alone. We are so grateful. Love, Elena. Margaret set down the letter, her mind reeling. This didn't sound like an affair. This sounded like something else, but what? She read another letter, then another. All from Elena. All thanking Robert for his help, his support, his presence in her children's lives. One mentioned how Sophie had cried with joy when Robert came to her school play. Another talked about Danny's birthday and how Robert had made it special. But why? Why would Robert do all this? Give all this? To someone else's children? Margaret looked around the kitchen again, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't a love nest. There were no romantic photos, no signs of a relationship between Robert and this Elena woman. Just photos of kids and the man they clearly adored. On the counter, she noticed a notebook. She opened it to find more of Robert's handwriting. Lists, mostly. Danny needs new cleats for soccer. Sophie's keyboard making weird noise. Check batteries. Science fair next month. Help Danny with volcano project. Sophie wants to learn that song from the movie. Download sheet music. The last entry was dated 2 weeks before Robert died. Danny stressed about college applications. Spend extra time going over essay. Remind him he's smart enough for any school. College applications. Danny was old enough for college. That meant he was 17, maybe 18. Margaret did the math quickly. If Robert had been doing this for 15 years, Danny would have been just a toddler when it started. Sophie even younger, maybe a baby. 15 years of every Saturday. 15 years of being Uncle Robert to children who weren't his own. 15 years of keeping this massive secret from his wife, his own children, everyone. But why the secrecy? If this was just Robert being generous, helping a family in need, why not tell her? She would have understood. She would have helped, probably. Robert knew that. He knew she had a good heart, unless he didn't think she'd understand. Unless there was something about this situation that he thought she wouldn't accept. Margaret heard a noise outside and froze. Footsteps on the front walk. Her heart started racing. She stood up quickly, knocking the chair backwards. The front door was still open from when she'd come in. A woman's voice called out, tentative and worried. Robert, is that your car out there? I saw someone come in and I got worried. A woman appeared in the doorway, maybe 40 years old, with long, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was wearing scrubs like she'd just come from a hospital shift. When she saw Margaret instead of Robert, she stopped dead. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Margaret saw her own shock reflected in the other woman's face. Who are you? The woman asked, her voice shaking. Where's Robert? Margaret's throat was so tight she could barely speak. I'm Margaret. Margaret Hayes. The woman's face went pale. Oh my God, you're his wife, yes. Margaret's voice came out stronger than she felt. And I think you're Elena. Elena nodded slowly, tears filling her eyes. He's really gone, isn't he? I kept hoping maybe it was a mistake, maybe. Her voice broke. 3 weeks ago, Margaret said. Heart attack. Elena sat down hard on the couch, putting her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook as she cried. Margaret stood in the kitchen, unsure what to do. This woman was grieving her husband. This woman whose children called him Uncle Robert. This woman who had shared part of his life that Margaret knew nothing about. After a minute, Elena looked up, wiping her eyes. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You must be. I can't even imagine what you must think. I don't know what to think, Margaret said honestly. I found the deed to this house yesterday. I came to see. She gestured helplessly at the room. To see what this was. Elena took a shaky breath. We need to talk. There's so much you don't know, so much Robert never told you. She stood up. But not here. Can we go somewhere? Maybe for coffee? I need to explain everything. Margaret barely remembered driving to the coffee shop. Elena had suggested a place nearby, and somehow Margaret's car had ended up in the parking lot, though she couldn't recall the actual journey. Her mind was too full, spinning too fast. They sat at a corner table away from other customers. Elena ordered tea but didn't touch it. Margaret didn't order anything. She couldn't imagine eating or drinking right now. Her stomach felt like it was tied in knots. I don't even know where to start, Elena said, her voice quiet. She twisted a napkin in her hands over and over. Robert said this day might come, that I might have to explain things someday. But I never thought, I hoped. She stopped, took a breath. I'm sorry. This must be so awful for you. Just tell me, Margaret said. Her voice came out flat, emotionless. She felt numb, like she was watching this happen to someone else. Tell me everything. Elena nodded. She stared down at her tea, gathering her thoughts. 15 years ago, my husband Diego worked construction. He and Robert were on the same crew, working on a big commercial building downtown. They weren't close friends exactly, but they worked together every day. Talked during breaks. You know how it is. Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure she did know. Robert had rarely talked about his co-workers. He'd kept his work life and home life separate. Diego was always careful, Elena continued. Always followed the safety rules. He used to joke that I worried too much, but he promised me he'd always come home. Her voice cracked. But one day he didn't. Margaret felt a chill run through her. She already knew where this was going. There was an accident, a scaffolding collapse. Diego and 2 other men fell. Elena wiped her eyes with the napkin. The other 2 men lived. Diego didn't. He died right there before the ambulance even arrived. Robert was there. He saw the whole thing. "I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered. And she meant it. Whatever else was going on, whatever else she'd learned today, she understood the pain of losing a husband. "I was 25 years old," Elena said. "I had a 3-year-old son, and I was 6 months pregnant with my daughter. No family in this country, no savings, no life insurance. The construction company gave me $20,000 and said they weren't liable. Their lawyers said Diego had made a mistake, that it was his fault." Margaret's hands tightened around the edge of the table. $20,000 for a man's life, for leaving a widow and 2 children. "Robert came to the funeral," Elena continued. "I'd never met him before. He introduced himself, said he was sorry, said if I needed anything." She shook her head. "I thought it was just something people say. Empty words. But a week later he showed up at my apartment with groceries. Said he couldn't stop thinking about Danny, about the baby coming, about me all alone. He kept coming back," Elena said. "Once a week at first, just to check on me. He helped me fill out paperwork for benefits. He drove me to doctor appointments when I was too pregnant to drive. He was there when Sophie was born, actually, waiting in the hospital parking lot in case I needed anything." Margaret tried to picture it. Robert at a hospital waiting for another woman to give birth, while Margaret had been home thinking he was at work. It felt like someone was twisting a knife in her chest. "I knew he was married," Elena said quickly. "He talked about you sometimes. About his kids. He showed me pictures once. He said you had a good life, a nice house, that his family was taken care of. But he couldn't stop thinking about Diego, about how it should have been prevented, about how the company just paid me off and moved on. So he decided to help you," Margaret said. "It wasn't a question. More than help. He saved us." Elena's eyes filled with tears again. "I was about to lose my apartment. I was applying for every job I could find, but nobody wants to hire someone with a newborn. I was going to have to move back to Mexico, back to a town where I had nothing and nobody. And then Robert showed up and told me he'd bought a house." Margaret's breath caught. 15 years ago. Yes, he said I could live there. No rent ever. He'd pay the utilities and the property taxes. All I had to do was take care of the place and my children. Elena looked down at her hands. I thought he was joking at first. People don't just give other people houses. But he was serious. He took me to see it, gave me the keys, and that was it. We moved in a week later. Why didn't he tell me? The question burst out of Margaret before she could stop it. Why all the secrecy? Elena was quiet for a moment. He said you'd want to help too, that you'd probably want to do even more. But he didn't want that. He didn't want recognition. He didn't want to be thanked or praised. He said if his family knew, it would become this big thing. People would have opinions about how much was too much, about whether we deserved it, about whether he was being smart with money. Margaret opened her mouth to argue, then closed it, because Elena was right. If Robert had told her 15 years ago that he'd spent $75,000 on a house for a stranger, she would have had questions. Lots of questions. And their adult children, when they found out, would have questioned it even more. He also said, Elena continued carefully, that he felt guilty, not about helping us, but about how much time he was spending with us. With Danny and Sophie. He said it didn't feel right to do it openly when he had his own family to take care of. Time? Margaret repeated. How much time? Every Saturday for 15 years, Elena said softly. Sometimes more if there was something special happening. He came to every school play, every soccer game, every piano recital. He helped with homework. He taught Danny how to ride a bike and how to throw a football. He taught Sophie how to play piano. She paused, choosing her words carefully. He was the father my children never got to have. Margaret felt like she couldn't breathe. Every Saturday for 15 years. All those mornings Robert had kissed her goodbye and driven across town to be Uncle Robert. To be a father to someone else's children. Did you love him? The question came out before Margaret could stop it. Elena looked shocked. What? No, God, no. Not like that. He was family, but not like that. He was more like a brother to me, or an uncle, or I don't know how to explain it. We were never romantic, never. He loved you. He talked about you all the time. Then why did he do it? Elena finished. I asked him that once about 5 years ago. Why us? Why so much? Why keep doing it year after year? She smiled sadly. He said he'd seen Diego die. He said he'd watched it happen and he couldn't do anything to stop it. He said he'd heard Diego's last words, which were, "Tell Elena I love her." And he said he'd made a promise to himself right then that Diego's family wouldn't suffer if he could help it. Margaret's eyes burned with tears. That sounded like Robert. Noble, stubborn Robert who felt responsible for everything. But it became more than that, Elena continued. He fell in love with Danny and Sophie. Not in a weird way, she added quickly. In the way grandparents love their grandchildren. In the way teachers love their students. He was so proud of them. Every good grade, every accomplishment, every little thing. He'd show me pictures on his phone from their recitals and games, beaming like they were his own kids. They weren't his kids, Margaret said, and she hated how bitter she sounded.
He had his own kids. I know. Elena's voice was gentle.
And he loved them too. He talked about your son and daughter all the time. How proud he was when your son graduated college. How beautiful your daughter looked at her wedding. But his kids were grown and gone, living their own lives. Danny and Sophie still needed someone. And Robert needed to be needed. Margaret sat back in her chair, trying to process everything. Robert had created this whole second family. Not out of romantic love or deceit, but out of guilt and compassion and maybe loneliness. He'd filled his empty nest with borrowed children, given them the father they'd lost, and never told anyone because he knew they wouldn't understand, or because he was ashamed. Were you the only ones who knew? Margaret asked. Elena shook her head. The kids, obviously, and my mother back in Mexico, though she never really understood. She thought Robert was crazy, giving away so much for nothing, and a few people at the kids' schools, I think, who assumed Robert was their grandfather or something, but we never corrected them. Robert asked us not to talk about it with anyone. He said it was private between us. Like a secret, Margaret said. Like a gift, Elena corrected gently. He called it that once. He said helping us was a gift he was giving himself, that it made him feel like Diego hadn't died for nothing, that it gave his death meaning. They sat in silence for a while. Other customers came and went. Someone laughed at another table. The coffee machine hissed and gurgled. Normal sounds in a normal coffee shop while Margaret's entire world rearranged itself. The kids don't know he's gone, Elena said finally. I haven't told them yet. Danny's away at a college visit, and Sophie's been at her friend's house all week for spring break. I kept thinking Robert would show up for his Saturday visit, and when he didn't, I thought maybe he was sick. Then I saw the obituary in the paper. Margaret winced. The obituary. She'd written it herself, listing Robert's surviving family. His wife, Margaret. His son and daughter. His grandchildren. No mention of Danny and Sophie, these children who'd known him as Uncle Robert, who'd spent every Saturday with him for 15 years. They're going to be devastated, Elena whispered. Robert was everything to them. He believed in them when nobody else did. He pushed them to dream big. Danny wants to be an engineer, just like Robert always said he could be. Sophie wants to study music education. Robert made them believe they could do anything. When do they come home? Margaret asked. Tomorrow. Danny's driving back in the morning, and I'm picking up Sophie in the afternoon. Elena looked at Margaret with red, exhausted eyes. I don't know how to tell them. I don't know how to explain that Uncle Robert is gone and they never even got to say goodbye. Margaret thought about her own children, how hard Robert's death had hit them. They'd had time to say goodbye, time at the hospital before the end. These kids would have nothing, just the sudden absence of someone who'd been a constant in their lives. I want to meet them, Margaret heard herself say. Elena looked up, surprised. What? I want to meet Danny and Sophie. I want to... She paused, not sure what she wanted exactly. To see these children who'd known a side of Robert she'd never seen. To understand what had been so special about them that Robert had kept them secret for 15 years. To be angry at them for taking her husband's time. To thank them for making him happy. Maybe all of it, are you sure? Elena asked carefully. Margaret wasn't sure about anything anymore. But she nodded anyway. Yes, tomorrow at the house. I'll be there when you tell them. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every Saturday morning for the past 15 years. Robert kissing her forehead before he left. Robert whistling as he grabbed his keys. Robert coming home with that particular kind of tired happiness she'd never quite understood. Now she understood. He'd been tired from chasing soccer balls with Danny, and happy from hearing Sophie play piano. He'd been living 2 lives and she'd only known about one. At 3 in the morning, she got up and went to Robert's closet. She'd been avoiding it, couldn't bear to see his clothes hanging there like he might come back and need them, but now she opened the door and breathed in the smell of him. That mixture of sawdust and aftershave and something uniquely Robert. She pulled out his wallet from the dresser, the one the hospital had given back to her with his other belongings. She'd looked through it once just to find his insurance card. Now she looked again. Really looked. Behind his driver's license, she found a small photo, worn at the edges like it had been taken out and looked at many times. Danny and Sophie, maybe 5 years younger than they were now, both grinning at the camera, gap-toothed and sun-browned. On the back, in careful child's handwriting, "We love you, Uncle Robert." Danny and Sophie. He'd carried them with him. Every day, everywhere he went, right next to his license. Right next to the photo of Margaret and their own kids. She sat on the bed holding the photo and let herself cry. Not angry tears this time. Just sad, confused, overwhelmed tears. Tears for the husband she'd lost. Tears for the husband she'd never fully known. Tears for 2 kids who were about to lose someone precious. The next morning, Margaret drove to Maple Street at 10 o'clock. Elena had said to come early before Danny got home from his college visit. They needed time to talk, to prepare, to figure out how to explain everything. But when Margaret pulled up, there was already a car in the driveway she didn't recognize. Through the front window, she could see movement inside. She knocked on the door and Elena answered, looking flustered. "You're early, thank God. Danny got home an hour ago. I couldn't keep him from coming over." He wanted to know why Robert hadn't been answering his texts. Before Margaret could respond, a voice called from inside. "Mom, is that Uncle Robert? I need to tell him about the engineering program at..." A teenage boy appeared behind Elena and stopped dead when he saw Margaret. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair that needed cutting and warm brown eyes that looked uncertain. He was wearing a college sweatshirt and jeans, and he looked so much like the boy in Robert's wallet photo, just older. More grown up. Almost a man. "Oh," he said. "Sorry, I thought, who are you?" Margaret's throat closed up. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. This was Danny, the little boy Robert had taught to ride a bike. The teenager Robert had helped with college essays. The young man who wanted to be an engineer, just like Robert always said he could be. "Danny, this is Margaret," Elena said softly. "Margaret Hayes, she needs to talk to you. To both of you. Is Sophie awake?" "Yeah, she's in her room." Danny's face showed confusion, but also good manners. "Nice to meet you, ma'am. Are you a friend of Uncle Robert's?" The question stabbed Margaret in the heart. Friend, if only it were that simple. Something like that, she managed to say. "Can I come in?" They sat in the living room, the 4 of them. Sophie had emerged from her bedroom, a thin girl with long dark hair and those same warm brown eyes. She was 15, Elena had said. She sat next to her mother, already looking worried. "Where's Uncle Robert?" Danny asked. "I've been texting him all week about the college visit and he hasn't answered." "Is he okay?" Margaret looked at Elena, who looked back at her helplessly. This was it. The moment these kids' lives changed forever. "Robert is my husband," Margaret said. The words felt strange in her mouth. "Was my husband. He passed away 3 weeks ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Danny's face went from confusion to disbelief to dawning horror. Sophie made a small sound like someone had punched her in the stomach. "No," Danny said. "No, that's not. He can't be. He was just here. He was just..." His voice cracked. 3 weeks ago? "Heart attack," Margaret said quietly. "It was very sudden." "He didn't suffer." Sophie started crying, huge silent tears rolling down her face. Elena pulled her close, but Sophie just kept staring at Margaret like she might take it back. "Might say it was a mistake. But he was going to help me with my college applications," Danny said. "And he sounded about 5 years old. He promised. We were going to work on them together this summer."
He said. His voice broke completely.
"He said he'd help me. I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered. And she was. She was sorry these kids were hurting. Sorry they hadn't known. Sorry for all of it. Were you at the funeral? Danny asked. Was there a funeral? Margaret nodded. 3 weeks ago. I didn't know about you then. I just found out about this house 2 days ago. Danny and Sophie looked at each other, then at their mother. Some wordless communication passed between them. She didn't know about us? Sophie asked Elena, her voice thick with tears. Uncle Robert never told her? No, sweetheart. He didn't tell anyone in his family. Why not? Danny's voice rose. Were we like a secret? Like something to be ashamed of? No, Margaret said firmly. She surprised herself with how strongly she said it. No, you weren't something to be ashamed of. Robert, she stopped, trying to find the right words. Robert loved you both very much. Your mother told me everything yesterday. About your father. About how Robert helped you. About every Saturday for 15 years. Then why keep us secret? Danny demanded. If we weren't something bad, why hide us? It was a fair question. Margaret had been asking herself the same thing all night. I think, she said slowly, he was trying to protect everyone. Protect you from people who might judge or question. Protect his own family from feeling hurt or confused. Protect himself from having to explain something he maybe didn't fully understand. That's stupid, Danny said, but there was no heat in it, just pain. We could have met you. We could have been part of his whole life, not just some secret thing he did on Saturdays. I know, Margaret said, and I wish he had told me. I wish I'd known about you. I wish a lot of things. Sophie spoke up for the first time, her voice small. Did he talk about us? To you, I mean. Before you knew? Margaret thought about it. Had Robert mentioned them even in passing? But no, not directly. He'd talked about his Saturdays sometimes, about helping a friend or running errands. Nothing specific. Nothing real? No, she admitted. He didn't, but I think that hurt him too. I think he wanted to. Can I show you something? Sophie stood up suddenly and disappeared into her room. She came back carrying a shoebox, worn and battered. She sat down next to Margaret on the couch and opened it. Inside were papers. Lots of them. Cards, notes, photos, all jumbled together. Sophie pulled out a birthday card. This is from my 8th birthday. See what he wrote? Margaret read Robert's handwriting. Dear Sophie, you're getting so big and so talented. I'm proud of you every single day. Never stop making beautiful music. Love, Uncle Robert. Sophie pulled out another card. Christmas when I was 10. Another one. When I got accepted into the special music program. Another. Just because it was Tuesday. There were dozens of them. Years and years of cards and notes, all in Robert's handwriting. All saying basically the same thing. I'm proud of you. I believe in you. Keep going. You're special. He never missed a birthday, Sophie said, tears streaming down her face. He never missed anything important. He came to every single piano recital, even the bad ones where I messed up. He sat in the front row and clapped the loudest. Danny had pulled out his phone. He handed it to Margaret without a word. The screen showed a text conversation with someone named Uncle Robert. Margaret scrolled up, seeing months and months of messages. Dad jokes, check-ins, encouragement, how'd the math test go? Robert had written in January. Aced it thanks to you, Danny had replied. That's all you, kiddo. I just pointed you in the right direction. You always point me in the right direction. Margaret scrolled further. Pictures Danny had sent of college campuses. Long conversations about which schools to apply to. A panicked message from Danny at 2 a.m. about an essay deadline. And Robert's response an hour later. Called in sick tomorrow. Come over at 8 a.m. We'll knock it out together. He helped me apply to 14 schools, Danny said. We spent hours on those applications. He read my essays like 50 times. He drove me to campus visits on his day off. His voice broke again. He was supposed to be there when I found out if I got in. He promised. Margaret handed back the phone with shaking hands. She'd thought she knew Robert. Thought she knew what kind of man he was. But this was something else. This was a level of commitment and love and dedication that took her breath away. Show her the videos, Sophie said to her brother. Danny pulled up his photo gallery, video after video of Robert, teaching Danny how to change a tire, helping Sophie learn a complicated piano piece, making pancakes in this very kitchen, playing basketball in the driveway, reading stories when they were little, teaching them both how to swim at a public pool. In every video, Robert was smiling, really genuinely smiling, the same smile he'd had in his wedding photos. The same smile he'd had when their own children were born. Pure joy. He made us feel like we mattered, Sophie said quietly, like we were worth something. My dad died before I was born. I never knew him. But Uncle Robert, she couldn't finish. She just cried into her mother's shoulder. Danny wiped his eyes roughly. I was going to ask him to walk me across the stage at graduation. I already talked to the principal about it. They said it was fine, that he could be listed as family. He laughed bitterly. Guess that's not happening now. Margaret felt something shift inside her. All night she'd been wrestling with hurt and betrayal and confusion, wondering why Robert had done this, why he'd kept it secret, why these children had gotten so much of him. But looking at Danny and Sophie, at their grief and their love, at all these cards and messages and videos, she finally understood. Robert hadn't been having an affair or living a double life or hiding something shameful. He'd been doing what he did best, loving people, taking care of people, making people feel like they mattered, and these kids had needed that. They'd lost their father before they could even know him. Elena had been doing her best alone, but there were things a mother couldn't be, gaps she couldn't fill. Robert had filled those gaps. He'd been the father they needed, the grandfather figure, the cheerleader, the steady presence. Tell me more, Margaret said suddenly. Tell me everything. I want to hear all of it, so they did. For the next 3 hours, Danny and Sophie told her about Uncle Robert. The time he'd taken Danny fishing and they'd both fallen in the lake. The time he'd helped Sophie prepare for a music competition and she'd won first place. The time he taught them both how to make his famous chili, and they'd burned it so badly the smoke alarm went off. The time he'd stayed up all night with Danny when Danny was sick and Elena had to work a double shift. 1,000 small moments. 1,000 ordinary days that had meant everything to these kids. 1,000 pieces of Robert that Margaret had never seen. He used to say something, Sophie said. Whenever we thanked him for something, we'd say thank you for the help or the gift or whatever, and he'd always say the same thing. What? Margaret asked. He'd say, that's what family does. Sophie smiled through her tears. Even though we weren't really family, not by blood. He'd say it anyway. That's what family does. Margaret felt tears running down her own face now. That was pure Robert. Of course he'd said that. Of course he'd seen these children as family, even if nobody else knew about it. Can I show you something? Margaret pulled out her phone with shaking hands. She opened her photos and found the one she was looking for. The wallet photo she'd taken a picture of last night. Danny and Sophie, younger and gap-toothed. He carried this every day, she said, right next to his driver's license. Right next to the photo of me and our kids. He took it out and looked at it. I can tell from how worn the edges are. Sophie took the phone, staring at the photo. Danny looked over her shoulder. They were both crying again. We gave him that picture, Danny said. I remember. Sophie had just lost her front tooth. We thought the picture was terrible, but he said it was perfect. It was perfect, Margaret said, because it was you. She looked at these two teenagers, nearly grown now, but still so young, and she made a decision. Robert had loved them. Robert had chosen them day after day, Saturday after Saturday for 15 years. And Robert had been the best man she'd ever known. If he'd loved them, then they were worth loving. If he'd seen them as family, then they were family. Simple as that. I need to tell you something, Margaret said. I need you both to listen carefully. They looked at her, waiting. Robert was my husband, and I loved him very much. And yes, I wish he'd told me about you. I wish I'd known. But I understand why he did what he did, and I understand why you meant so much to him. She took a deep breath. And I want you to know that this house, your home, it's yours. For as long as you need it. Forever if you want. I'm not taking it away. I'm not changing anything, Elena gasped. Margaret, you don't have to. Yes, I do, Margaret said firmly. Robert wanted you to have this house. He wanted to take care of you. And I'm going to honor that. I'm going to honor him. But, Danny started. No buts, Margaret said. Robert was family to you. And now, if you'll let me, I'd like to be family too. The first few weeks after that day were strange and awkward. Margaret would show up at the Maple Street house not knowing quite what her role was supposed to be. Not Robert. Not a mother. Not a grandmother exactly. Just someone trying to fill a gap that couldn't really be filled. She brought groceries the first Saturday the way Robert used to. Elena tried to refuse, but Margaret insisted. Please, she'd said, let me do this. Danny and Sophie were polite but distant. They called her Mrs. Hayes. They thanked her for everything. But there was a wall between them built of grief and confusion and the awkwardness of this impossible situation. Margaret understood. She was grieving too, and she was still trying to reconcile the Robert she'd known with the Robert who'd lived this secret life. Some days she was angry at him. Some days she missed him so much she could barely breathe. Some days both at once. Her own children had been shocked when she told them about Danny and Sophie. Her son Paul had been angry at first. He spent how much money? On strangers? While we were taking out student loans? They weren't strangers to him, Margaret had said quietly. They were family. Her daughter Lisa had been more understanding but confused. I just don't get why he didn't tell us, Mom. We would have been okay with it. Would you have been? Margaret asked. Really? If 15 years ago, when you were still in middle school, your father had come home and said he was buying a house for some woman and her kids, would you have understood? Lisa had been quiet. I don't know. Maybe not. It took 3 weeks before Sophie called her by her first name instead of Mrs. Hayes. They were at the house and Sophie was practicing piano. Margaret had come by to drop off some papers, legal things related to the house that needed signatures. She'd planned to leave right away, but Sophie had asked if she wanted to stay and listen. So Margaret sat on the couch while Sophie played. The same couch she'd sat on that first day when her world had fallen apart. Sophie played a complicated classical piece, her fingers flying over the keys. She made a few mistakes, but kept going just like Robert had taught her. When she finished, Margaret applauded. That was beautiful. Sophie turned around on the bench, smiling shyly. Thanks. Uncle Robert was helping me with it. I still can't get this one part right where the tempo changes. He was going to show me, but she stopped. Sorry, I shouldn't talk about him so much. Why not? Margaret asked. Because it probably makes you sad or mad. I don't know. Margaret got up and sat next to Sophie on the piano bench. It makes me both sometimes, but that's okay. And you should talk about him. He was important to you. Sophie nodded. She played a few notes, soft and uncertain. Do you play? A little. Robert tried to teach me years ago, but I was terrible at it. He never told us he was married, Sophie said quietly. I mean, we knew he had a family. He'd mention his kids sometimes, or you. But he never really talked about it much. I thought maybe, I don't know what I thought. That his family didn't need him the way we did, maybe. The words hurt, but Margaret understood them. Robert's own children had been grown and gone, living their own lives. They called on holidays. They visited occasionally. But they didn't need him the way these kids had needed him. Can you show me? The part you're stuck on? Sophie's face lit up. She played the section, stopping where the tempo changed. See? It's supposed to speed up here, but smoothly. Uncle Robert said I was rushing it, that I needed to feel the change, not just play it. Margaret listened to her play it again. Robert always said music was about feeling, not just notes. Yeah, Sophie smiled. That's exactly what he said. Can you... She hesitated. Can you help me, maybe? I'm not as good as Robert was. That's okay. You knew him. Maybe some of it rubbed off. So they worked on it together, Margaret trying to remember what Robert had taught her decades ago. It wasn't perfect, but Sophie got a little better. And when she finally played it through without rushing, they both cheered. Thanks, Margaret, Sophie said. And there it was, Margaret, not Mrs. Hayes. A small thing, but it felt huge. Danny took longer. He was dealing with his grief by throwing himself into college applications and schoolwork. He barely spoke during Margaret's visits, just nodded hello and went back to his room. But one Saturday in May, Margaret arrived to find Danny sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. Looking frustrated and lost. Everything okay? She asked.